it works. So I had built this number of years ago, our smokehouse, and we've used it for years. Use it for smoking meat, smoking fish. We smoke our brain tan deer hides in it as well. And the traditional way of doing hides is you smoke one at a time. Basically takes a day. The last time I smoked hides in the smokehouse, I believe I did 7 hides. So yeah, it really increases productivity. And I think I could actually do about 10 in this one. Anyway, there's a few things that aren't historically accurate here. The tin roof. So I'm going to get some cedar hauled out here and make some shakes, and I've got to get shakes for the outhouse as well. But it's going to be quite effective back here once we get it done. So, a wee bit of history about the wood stove. It was actually patented in 1557 in France, and it was much more efficient than the fireplaces of the time. But it was pretty crude, and the reason it didn't catch on was iron of any kind was hugely expensive, so only the affluent could own them. So if we fast forward a couple of hundred years, the Industrial Revolution is well underway, and this fellow named Benjamin Franklin down there, quite an inventor, he decides that he should look into making a device that would be much more efficient than the typical hole-in-the-wall chimney, and he builds the first Franklin wood stove. And indeed it was. It turns out it was about 40% efficient versus a 20% efficient fireplace. And it needed to be done because at the time in Philadelphia, the population was burgeoning, firewood was running out, they had to bring it for miles and miles to feed thousands of chimneys. Enter another Benjamin, and we got Sir Benjamin Thompson. He was born in America. When the American Revolution breaks out, he was a Tory, so he fought for the British, and he served as a lieutenant colonel in the King's American Dragoons. Obviously, war's over, America wins, Benjamin's got to leave. Now, he was well known as Count Rumford from his German heritage. He goes back to England. He's a physicist, and he studies thermodynamics, and he made huge inroads in all kinds of things associated with heat, airflow, friction, and an inventor. And he thought he could improve on the actual fireplace. So he designed a fireplace similar to the one we built in our little cabin. And it wasn't quite as efficient as Benjamin Franklin's cast iron stove, but it was awfully close. It was about 35% efficient, which was a huge improvement at the time. But he also was a crazy inventor. They used to separate lime by heating it, and the problem was it always got contaminated with wood ash. Well, he designed a furnace with 2 Venturas that would separate the lime from the wood ash. He invented the double boiler, apparently. And the one I love best is he invented the coffee percolator. And I do like my perk coffee. Anyway, that's a wee bit of history about the wood stove. It's not quite historically accurate for our time frame, but awfully close. And we're going to try to, as I mentioned, we'll fix up our old smokehouse back there to look a little more authentic. So the deer hunting season is just about upon us, and we were unsuccessful at the moose hunt. If you followed us, you would have seen that. So we're kind of doubling down on our deer hunting efforts. So I'm out scouting about every morning, and this morning I got treated once again to the most outstanding sunrise one could imagine. Literally, the sky was ablaze. Anyway, I've had a number of questions about how I tie my sash, so I'm going to do an actual tutorial here. But before I do it, I'll talk a wee bit about the sash. It was a common piece of clothing for literally hundreds of years. It was as common as a man's hat. And in fact, it's still used today by military around the world in their ceremonial or their dress uniforms, if you would, officers and such wearing their burgundy sashes or scarlet sashes, what have you. Anyway, a good friend of mine made this one, and typically in the time period that we portray, 1750s, wool was probably the most common one. And a good friend of mine named Heather, she weaves these by hand. Nice chevron pattern, and she was explaining to me that the indigenous peoples put a lot more significance into colors than we do. We pick colors for their aesthetics. So the sash I typically wear, I just like the color, so I wear it all the time. But to natives, these colors meant something. So this one's, she gifted this beautiful sash to my wife, and it's supposed to represent the circle of life. So I know, and I can't quite remember because it was gifted a number of years ago, but the black represents death, and I think the white represents birth and the red life, or vice versa. I'm not sure, but anyway, that's an interesting thing. Anyway, on to my tutorial on how to tie a sash. So I mentioned tying a sash. In fact, what I do is more of a wrap than a knot. You can tie an overhand knot, a square knot, or what have you, but you end up with this big lump in your back, and it's quite uncomfortable sitting in a chair, etc. So I start off by putting a 90-degree bend in. I leave the amount of tail I want exposed at the back. I pinch that 45 that I've created, go around the waist, cross over that 45, around the waist a second time, go past the vertical piece of tail you've left, come up through, straighten it all out, give a little pull, and I don't know why it stays, but it never comes undone on me. I guess part of the fact is it's wool on wool. Last thing is I spin that around to the back. Typically they were worn in the back if one looks at oil paintings in sketches from the 17 and 1800s. Voyageurs were the exception. Most French Canadian voyageurs wore the knot on their side. I'm not sure. They probably wore it on the side they didn't paddle on. Keep the knot out of their way and keep the ends from their going in the water, which is always in the bottom of a birch bark canoe to some extent. Last thing, take my long knife, insert it in sash, and I'm off trekking. Grab my musket and hopefully find some deer. This ain't too hard a job compared to some of the jobs I've been doing of late. What I'm doing today is making a mortar. I still got to find the pestle. I could use a rock. They did use rocks. That was quite common. But I like to get a big old gnarly piece of wood and a shaft that I can turn down to use as my pestle. But a bit about preservation of food that our ancestors had to do in order to survive. We take it for granted today. They didn't have refrigeration, freezers, processed foods, and they certainly didn't have takeout. So they used a number of methods to preserve their food. One is the raised food cage that we recently built. So if one had a successful fall hunt, in late fall through the winter, you'd simply hang the quarters of meat up there and bacteria wouldn't form on it. A way to preserve it. The very common method was smoking it, so in the smokehouse. And essentially what you're doing is dehydrating the meat, but you're doing it in a hot, or in our case with the long pipe, a slow, warm, dry heat. But also the oils in the wood will encase the meat after it's dried, which also extends its longevity. So well-smoked meat can last upwards of a year. And unlike the meat, if we think of going to the store and buying jerky today, it's rubbery, but you can chew on it. Well, the smoked meats that were done back in the 18th, 19th century, they were bone hard. So they would use the mortar and pestle, and they would pound it into a powder, and that would be rehydrated in stews and such. They also made pemmican. So another form of dehydration is simply using the sun. Berries, for example, they'd lay out on sheets of birch bark, dehydrate the berries. So they take the dried berries, the pounded down meat, animal fat, and they pound it all into a cake, which was called pemmican. And the indigenous peoples in the 16, 17, 1800s had quite an industry with the larger fur trading companies to supply them with pemmican for getting trade items from the forts. Another method would be fermentation. So sauerkraut's an example. We make it every year, lasts through the winter. And wine. Yeah, you ferment wine. And they did that from wild grapes. Or if they, I suppose at some time they bring domesticated grapes from Europe, but mostly from wild grapes. Quite tart, I might add, quite tart. And the last method, and a very common method, would have been salting things. So salting fish, and they would dry salt that fish. For meats like pork and beef that they may raise on their homesteads, they would make a brine, put it in a barrel, and immerse the meat in it. And if any of you have ever tried salted pork, it is salty. So they would rinse it and re-rinse it and re-rinse it, and then finally cook it up, but it still was quite salty. Anyway, those are some of the methods that they use for food preservation. So I'm going to be working on this for a while. I'll try to go out tomorrow and scout about the woodlot, see if I can find a pestle for it, but I'd like to get this burned out and smoothed out, so I've got a surface to pound. I'm also going to be parching a bit of corn here shortly. We've got the cobs all dried, and I'd like to get that done and down for the winter. Back to my hard job.